Everyone ready? Okay, here we go. Welcome to Merryn Talks Money, the podcast in which people who know the markets explain the markets. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, and with us today we have a special guest, Paul Johnson, who is director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and has been since 2011. And I will say for people who aren't here, which will be most people, we are recording this in front of an audience today, which is very exciting. It's a first for us. Also with me today, of course, is John Stepek, who's going to stay with us for the entire conversation today, as opposed to just being shoved on at the beginning and the end like he usually is. So John, try and provide value, okay?
Do my best.
Now, Paul, one of the reasons we've got you on today is that you have written this fantastic book. It's called Follow the Money, How Much Does Britain Cost? And the answer I suspect that everyone here would give if they were allowed to put their hands up and give an answer now is kind of too much, right? Kind of too much. The tax burden is at an all-time high, right? We're paying more as a percentage of GDP and will be over the next few years than we've ever paid before. And we're not entirely sure that we're getting value. Is this absolutely necessary?
Well, you're absolutely right. We're spending more than ever. We are taxing more than ever. And actually, this Parliament has seen the biggest increase in tax of any Parliament ever, outside of wars anyway, which is a pretty extraordinary statement. The tax burden actually as a fraction of national income, pretty stable, about 34% of national income for decades. And it's suddenly bashed up to about 37%. That's about £100 billion tax rise. Now, lots of reasons for that. I mean, we kept taxes down by essentially abolishing the defence budget over decades. We've had a decade of austerity in public services, and all of that's stopped. There's no more defence to go. In fact, defence spending is going up. Austerity has almost certainly run its course, and indeed over this Parliament, spending has risen quite significantly. Very big spending on debt interest at the moment, and of course, serious demographic change. Lots more spending on health. And over the next few years, we're going to have lots more spending on pensions, social care, and so on. So my guess is that whilst this is the first time in my life that we've had taxes anywhere near this high, I don't think we're ever going to get down, certainly the rest of my life, to taxes where they have been for the last 70 years.
Yeah, but it's not always a government choice, is it? I mean, we've seen in the past, taxes as a percent of GDP, the burden as a percent of GDP creep up over 35%. But it always comes down again pretty quickly. There seems to be a level at which the Brits won't pay anymore. And if you look at the rates that other countries pay, you can see that in some Scandinavian countries, it tends to be higher and it can stay higher. And perhaps in the US, it's lower and it can stay lower. But each country seems to have an amount that they're prepared to pay beyond which they will not go. And for us, it looks like it's about 35%.
Well, that was certainly, I used to work in the Treasury, and that was absolutely the kind of house view in the Treasury. It's certainly at the sort of most senior levels, that there was a limit to what was feasible. Now we're testing that limit, and at the moment we're going through, if you count it as a single tax rise, the single biggest tax rise ever, which is the holding of the income tax personal allowance and thresholds at the same level in cash terms for 6 years. That's the policy. That is a £50 billion tax rise in one go. Much the biggest tax rise in history if you count that as a single one. And I think that will be the test. Is that something which drags hugely more people into higher rate tax? I think something like 1 in 6 adults will be paying higher rate tax by the end of that period, compared with something like 1 in 20 not very long ago. So that's a huge change. And I think that is where we'll test your proposition that actually this isn't sustainable. But my guess is that one way or another, we will keep at this kind of level of taxation, because it's so hard to see what is the government going to slash. Is it going to cut health spending, pension spending, welfare spending, education spending? We've done so much to get defence spending down. We've had a decade of austerity. We've got this demographic change. I think we might not like it, but I rather feel we're going to have to lump it in terms of the tax burden.
Yeah, let's just stick with this fiscal drag for a moment. I mean, in fact, it's an even bigger tax rise than the government might have thought initially, because inflation is so much higher than they expected initially. So that means that even more people are going to be pulled into these higher rates than the government might have expected when they first introduced this policy, right? And one of the things that John and I talk about a lot is the extent to which the 40% tax rate affects so many more people than anyone really thinks about. So when the Treasury look at it and they go, well, it's 1 in 4, it's 1 in 5, it's 1 in 6. But in fact, over a lifetime, over a career, of course, it's a much larger percentage of the population. And then if you take into account the partners of people who pay 40%, the children of people who pay 40%, etc., that higher rate affects a really large part of the tax-paying population.
It really does. I mean, you're right. Over a lifetime, I mean, people's salaries, incomes tend to peak in their 40s, say. So lots of people in their 20s at the moment not paying higher rate who will do. Lots of people in their 60s who aren't, who have done. So as a fraction of the population, it does get quite big. And we're not just looking at the 40% rate, of course. So there's the 60% rate for people earning between 100 and 125,000.
And then explain that quickly. Not everyone will understand how you get to 60%.
There is a 60% rate of income tax on incomes between 100 and 125,000 pounds. Now that is described as withdrawing the personal allowance. It is actually just a 60% marginal rate. And then of course there's a 45% marginal rate on incomes above that. We're now in a world actually where there are as many people paying 60 or 45% as 30 years ago there were people paying 40%. So the new higher rate actually is that sort of 60 and 45 level, and the 40 is becoming close to a second basic rate.
And in fact, of course, for a lot of people, it's way higher because once you've added on national insurance and you've added on student debt, which we think of as a tax, I know other people don't, but we think of it as a tax. Once you've added that on, some of the marginal rates of tax people are paying are insane.
Well, you've got not only that, but you've got even more insane things. So if you're married and you tip over to the 40% rate, you lose your married couples allowance. So you've got a tax rate of hundreds of percent. And if you've got kids, and you move over that 100,000 point, you lose all your childcare support. So actually, you can be earning 99,000, and you need a 35,000 pound increase in your pay to make it worthwhile. Anything less than that, and you're worse off than you were on 99,000. Now, that's a small fraction of the population, but that is an absurd situation.
I mean, the obvious question here, Paul, on that front is, why does nobody fix it? Because it's clearly mad. I realise that when you start pulling these threads, other things start to unravel. But is there not a better system that we could move? I mean, the system did not used to be this complicated.
There's so much you could do to make the system better. I mean, I think in terms of what we're talking about, I think the reason it's not changed is because governments frankly get away with it. I mean, it is quite a big revenue raiser having a 40p rate at 50,000. Very few people, I think, understand this point at the £100,000 change. And even if they did, I think electorally, we saw how incredibly unpopular the proposition a year ago was to get rid of the 45p rate. Now, in terms of that mini budget, that was by far the smallest of the tax cuts, would have cost very little compared with everything else. But even within the Conservative Party, it appeared to be incredibly unpopular. So I think actually kind of getting marginal rates down for higher earners doesn't appear to, as far as one can tell, have a great deal of popular demand behind it.
I suppose, and then the other thing that comes from, what you're talking about overall is that, okay, so let's assume we're going to need higher taxes for a prolonged period of time. What's the politics of that? Because one of the big problems is that I think, and I don't know if this is a fair representation of the audience or not, but I would say that people probably feel as if they are getting charged a lot of tax, but at the same time, the public services aren't getting better. A lot of them are getting worse, and there's no prospect of them getting better because all of the money is either going towards people getting old or towards, it's kind of paying for more of the same.
And increasingly it's going towards paying higher interest rates on government debt.
Yes, well, actually, it's not the government debt. So I guess the picture you're painting is you're going to be paying more and you're not going to be getting better public services. You might get worse ones.
It's horrible. I mean, it's horrible. It really is horrible. I mean, we are in this position where, if you look at the last budget red book, you've got tax at a record level, as we've discussed. You've got debt at a very high level, over 90% of national income, and stuck there, not going down. And yet the budget red book has penciled in what will effectively be cuts in public service spending through for many public services through the next parliament. And it is extraordinary.
And this is a function of our aging population.
This is a function of very high spending on debt interest, poor growth, and lots of spending on things like health, particularly, and pensions. So people are going to get pretty fed up, I think, and see taxes at record levels and this very, very tight spending situation.
Let's talk about, is there a way to make the tax system more efficient? I mean, one of the things that journalists do, and I'm guilty of this, is constantly talk about how the UK tax code is now as long as the complete works of Shakespeare or the longest novel ever written or whatever it is. We can always come up with these comparisons. And it gets longer and longer and longer and more complicated. Is there a way to simplify it, make it fairer? Are there any taxes that you think should go or any new taxes that should come in?
I mean, so many ways that you could make it better than it is. I mean, we have this absurd situation where we've got national insurance contributions, which are just a tax. They bear no relation to anything that people are entitled to, which you pay on earned income. So if you're a wage slave like me, you pay lots of that. If you're a partner at a professional services company, you don't. If you're self-employed, you pay a lot less. And if your income is coming from rents on a property you happen to earn or shares, you don't pay anything. You don't pay any national insurance on pension payment, but actually you don't pay it on pension contributions either. So number one, just admit that this is just a tax on income and you get rid of a lot of the complexity.
But then you'll make every pensioner in the land absolutely furious because they will say, I paid my NI already.
Which broadly they haven't. But let's
they haven't.
But let's look at this difference between, if I get my income as a self-employed person, I pay a lot less national insurance than if I do it as an employee. And if I incorporate, I pay less still. So that creates an enormous amount of complexity because you treat almost identical things completely differently. And that's true throughout the tax system. That's also true in terms of how we treat VAT. I mean, in the book, there's lots of laughs in the book, actually.
Actually, there are one or two laughs in the
book. We have this situation where you have to define exactly how much chocolate a gingerbread man has on it to determine whether it's got VAT on it or not. If you want a pet, get a rabbit. There's no VAT on rabbits because they're edible.
Don't tell your children.
So these are the sorts of absurdity. So a lot of these things happen when you treat similar things differently. And when you treat similar things differently, you have to have a wall of legislation to kind of tell you exactly where that boundary comes. Just one last thing on making the tax system better. My absolute number one priority would be getting rid of stamp duty. It's just, and I'm particularly talking about on housing here, it's just so damaging. It massively reduces the amount of time people move. It's unfair. It's inefficient. It's inequitable. It stuffs up the labour market. It stuffs up the housing market. But what have chancellors done year after year? Increase it. And that really is, if you could think of one, if I had to choose number one tax, which is super damaging, that will be it.
But what's mad about stamp duty in particular, and on shares as well, is that they keep putting it up on houses, etc., but also talking about introducing a wealth tax, which makes you want to tear your hair out because we have so many wealth taxes in the UK. There's stamp duty, there's IHT, there's non-indexed capital gains. These are all wealth taxes.
I mean, the point about wealth taxes, people talk about introducing wealth taxes. As you say, we've got inheritance tax, council tax, stamp duty, capital gains tax, and so on. The problem is they're all rubbish. I mean, they all, we need to get them right. Then maybe we can think about wealth tax, but just get the ones we got vaguely right rather than disastrous.
All of them. We could get rid of all of them and introduce a much simpler wealth tax. I mean, I don't approve of wealth taxes at all.
Possibly, but actually, we need a capital gains tax. But I mean, not least because if you don't have one,
tax. If it's a tax on inflation index.
Well, indeed,
gains,
and it should be on only real gains and possibly even only some fraction of real gains.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem then is, and I mean, I agree with all of this, obviously, because I'm somebody who would prefer lower taxes in a smaller state overall. But if your point is that we need to raise this 37% of GDP, then if you assume that is the case, then it's kind of got to come from somewhere. So
the rich, John, the rich.
I know it's always going to come from the rich, but if we've got this kind of system whereby we're going to have to be paying for, the NHS, we have to be paying for people getting older all the time, then anytime we talk about getting rid of taxes, we have to talk about, well, what are you going to replace that with? At least certainly that's what, the politicians' message is. So, what do you do if you decide that we shouldn't index link capital, that we should index link capital gains, for example? Where does the extra money come from?
I mean, for example, there you could match the capital gains rate to the income tax rate, and I think there's a strong case for that. If you've got that indexation in there, forgiveness of capital gains at death is outrageous, actually, and incredibly actually damaging to the economy, because people hold on to things beyond where they should. But if you look, Merryn said earlier, there are other countries with much higher levels of tax than we have. If you look at them, they don't get more from the rich. We get more than most from the rich, partly because we've got some pretty rich people, but 30% of all income tax comes from the top 1% of earners. They don't get it from corporates. We've got almost the biggest corporation tax system in the world now in terms of the fraction of national income that it brings in. At least that's the projection, given the new rate. They get it from people, I'm sad to say, on average and above average earnings and incomes. Now that's where the money comes from in other countries. And I think this is where the political debate is so dishonest, which is that, those who say they want more tax say, let's tax the rich, let's tax companies. If you want to make a big difference, it's from ordinary people it comes from. And that's exactly what's happening now. That £50 billion tax rise I mentioned earlier in terms of the non-indexation of allowances and thresholds, that's largely coming from people on average and maybe twice average earnings. It's not largely coming from the rich and from companies.
So it's making our system less progressive.
It's, broadly speaking, if you hold the personal allowance down, that is an unprogressive way of raising taxes.
I suppose if you have to broaden the tax base, then doing it by stealth is one way to do it.
Well, it's a lot easier than announcing big increases in the rates, isn't it?
Yeah, inflation, isn't it wonderful?
It's certainly helping the government.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Let's take a different approach to this. Instead of talking about how much more tax we can get out of people, let's talk about how we can encourage growth in the UK economy. And so much talk about this at the moment. Growth. Everyone's into growth. We all love growth. How on earth do we get growth in the UK?
Well, it's easy. I mean, we know how to do it. I mean, we really, 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 really do know how to do it, but we decide not to. I mean, it's, so sorting out the planning system, sorting out the tax system, as we've just described, would be good for growth. We know that. Sensible investment in infrastructure is clearly important. And not cutting spending on further education and vocational education, as has happened over the last 15 years or so. Building the roads and airports and so on that we need. Having a consistent strategy towards competition and R&D and all those sorts of things. And freer trade with the European Union. I mean, all of those things we know would be good for growth. And yet in each case, we have essentially prioritized other things. We don't build houses because we prioritize people who already have houses. And that means that people can't access the high paying jobs in London and the Southeast. We don't build the infrastructure which would link the Manchester and Sheffield and so on to surrounding areas so that people there can get into where the jobs are. We have cut spending on education, and particularly cut spending on education post 16. We cut through the 2010s. That's not quite so much now spending on infrastructure. Generally, as I say, we know what to do, and we don't do it largely for political reasons.
So we don't want it enough. We don't really want to grow. Or we have a huge part of the population that is happy, settled with what they have, and don't want anything to change. And they're the ones who vote.
But there's short-term cost and disruption against long-term, quite hard to grasp positive stuff through growth. So, it's always easier to say, well, triple lock the pension or increase spending on wages or do more on health or something, all of which are good things, but also popular. Whereas driving a road through someone's back garden or building houses in the field across the way, or increasing taxes to increase spending on education, or whatever, those are unpopular. So it's the politicians are feeble, but actually the electorate's pretty feeble as well on some of this.
We're going to have a massive change to the planning system anyway, aren't we? I mean, if we're going to get anywhere near net zero, for example, and we have to completely redo our national grid, we're going to have a pylon in pretty much every back garden. And that's going to involve a massive change to planning.
Well, we're going to have to. I mean, it's more expensive to build stuff in Britain than pretty much anywhere else. I mean, in terms of building roads, in terms of building energy infrastructure, in terms of building.
But that's okay because we just cancel them, right? That's fine.
Well, one of the reasons it's expensive is, the complete lack of government consistency on policy is also incredibly expensive. We've seen that on HS2 now. I mean. Personally, I used to work in the Treasury when we did big studies of this stuff. Clearly, there was never a strong case for HS2. Clearly, actually, having a whole series of better links across the north and better roads and so on, as Rishi Sunak has set out, that is the Treasury view. And take the man out of the Treasury, you can't take the Treasury out of the man.
So that you say there was never a good case for HS2, and the Treasury knew that. Then explain to those of us who don't understand these things how on earth it ever got through. How did we get here?
It's a political decision. I mean, I think there's I think it's a really interesting study of how these big infrastructure projects actually do get through. There's obviously there's a degree of lobbying. There's a degree of politicians wanting to be associated with big projects, and it's not a stupid bet. It is a bet. I mean, building HS2 was a huge bet that actually that would be enough to really make a difference to growth to Manchester and surrounding areas. Turned out to be a much more expensive bet than was suggested initially. I mean, 3 times the price, I think, than was suggested. But I think the pervasive failure here. I mean, first of all, it's for all the issues associated with lots of planning and building lots of things, it's turned out very expensive. But our complete lack of consistency. I mean, again, we've seen this in education policy. Again, the Prime Minister has said he wants to change the way we provide A-levels to give a broader curriculum. I think it's pretty sensible, actually. But no consistency. If you look over the things that happened over the last 20, 30 years, particularly in post-16 education, particularly vocational, it changes virtually every year. And you can't run a country like that and expect it to grow.
But do other countries run like that? I mean, is this sort of weird inconsistency a UK thing? Surely it's a global thing. No governments are consistent.
I think ours are less consistent. I mean, particularly given we supposedly had the same party in power for 13 years, I think ours are less consistent than most.
Yeah, I think that's stretching it really in terms of what's happened in the last 13 years. But I mean, from that point of view, do you see, because obviously there's a lot of frustration. I don't think that it's just, us thinking about these things. I mean, there's clearly a lot of irritation with the apparent inability to get anything done in the UK. Is there anything in the political sphere that kind of gives you, I don't know, a glimmer of hope that we might see a sort of culture change, or that we might see some political backbone developing, or some sensibleness at some point?
For those of you who aren't here, Paul's looking really downbeat.
Yeah, I'm trying to get Paul to say something cheerful, but I'm not sure it's going to happen.
We often try that with limited success. Look, I think we've done it in the past. I mean, whatever you think of the 80s and Thatcher and so on, they were big structural changes that were driven through in a reasonably consistent way. Whatever you think of the Blair years, there was a big sort of change to the way in which we funded stuff. I mean, not enough reform, arguably. So we have had long periods of reasonably consistent government in the past. I to some extent, I hope what we've seen over the last 7-8 years has been something of an aberration. And again, whatever you think of Brexit, it's clearly the case that politics just got broken essentially between 2016 and 2021. Let's take that, or actually, let's say 2022, given that we had the 49-day Prime Minister in 2022. Politics was very broken over that period on both sides. And I do see, actually, a move away from that.
I'm afraid we have to call an end to it there. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money. We'll be back next week. Catch our debrief on this week's conversation on the Merryn Talks Money after show under the Apple subscription feed. In the meantime, if you like our show, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode was hosted by me, Merryn Somerset Webb. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Additional editing by Blake Maples. Special thanks, of course, to Paul Johnson and to John Stepek. Be sure to sign up to John's daily newsletter, Money Distilled. The link for that is in the show notes.